G'day, mates. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast exploring topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. This episode is all about the Australian acacia, in particular, the DMT-containing, highly psychedelic Australian acacia trees, which is why I'm wearing this Australian hat, this shirt that I got here at the Rebel Herbal Gathering when I was out there participating in that conference in New South Wales back in 2019, and why I introduced the show with my ridiculous attempt at an Australian accent. So what do I mean by the drinking of Australian acacia trees? Well, and I've written this down here. It is the drinking of highly psychedelic brews made from DMT-containing native Australian acacia trees in combination with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor containing plant, usually Syrian rue. DMT from acacia is not a brand new concept. In fact, a lot of people who have smoked freebase DMT, likely there's a good chance they actually smoked DMT that was extracted from an acacia tree, probably an Australian acacia tree. In fact, a lot of changa, which is a type of smoking blend that combines DMT infused into a leaf substrate with a MAOI, monoamine oxidase inhibiting plant in it, gets made through Australian acacia DMT extracts. But the drinking of acacia is something unique and interestingly present in the Australian culture, and in particular in the underground psychedelic spirituality Australian culture. So terribly described, and thankfully we have a collection of people that will describe it much better than I can. But it was something I observed while I was out there, or there was something that I observed while I was out in Australia that I thought was incredibly interesting, which I think can be described as a growing underground movement of drinking these acacia brews as a part of a uniquely Australian spiritual culture based in connection to the land and communication with its plants. So that inspired and interested me significantly. And so I organized this, what's called the Psychedelic Cafe. I'll explain it in a second. I organized the Psychedelic Cafe to bring a collection of people on who were deeply experienced and versed in drinking Australian acacias and the history, pharmacology, and general research around the acacias to talk about it. In particular, to have a discussion around a central question. That central question being, where do the Australian psychoactive acacia species fit into the contemporary local psychedelic scene, and how does interaction with these species inform a deeper connection to that land and its dreaming? So that is what we're exploring here on the show today. We're going to just explore a whole lot about the highly psychedelic DMT-containing acacia native to Australia, and we're well, sorry, not my best intro ever. We're going to talk about the history, pharmacology, and phenomenology of the psychedelic acacia trees of Australia, as well as their conservation challenges of learning how to consume them, being that there is no known history of their ceremonial use, and the complications of using them in the context of colonialism. Also, we talk about plant intelligence, interspecies communication, and encounters with the unseen realm of spirits that exist beyond the invention of the human mind, or at least seemingly. So we go to a lot of different interesting places, and honestly, this conversation was not only exciting and curious and inspiring for me, from a wow, I'm so inspired by the information, from a inspired in interest kind of way, but it was also lighthearted and fun and positive. So I hope that you received that from this interview as well. Like I said, this is called the Psychedelic Cafe. It's a bit different than the other interviews that I do because it is not an interview per se. It's a structured digital talking circle that goes through a series of rounds. Now, instead of explaining here in the intro, I'm actually going to leave in the part of the recording on the Zoom call that I'd explained it to the participants, because I think I explained it pretty coherently. So once this intro is done, it's going to start with a description of the Psychedelic Cafe. But what I will say is that it is a conversational technology that I adapted, and by adapted, I mean gave it a different name, from Gene Robertson, who is a central figure in the Liminal Space Agency, a meta monastery here in Kitchener, Ontario, where I live. And that has been really inspiring for me, and I've had incredible conversations that have come out of it. Jean has previously been on the show, and I will leave a link to my episode with Jean in the description to this, in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. First, I would like to thank my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Without Patreon, I would not be able to do this. I would not be able to invest the full-time energy and the finances in order to commit to the production of this podcast and the larger, body of effort that goes into it, as well as the larger body of work that I have been doing around my research into especially consuming psilocybin as a part of a person's way in the world. That's not very descriptive, but any of you who have read my books know what I mean. So without Patreon, this wouldn't exist, and especially it wouldn't exist in a way where the content is totally up to me and you and not up to what serves advertising revenue. So thank you very much, patrons, for helping make this show for all of us to enjoy. If you're not yet a patron, please become one by heading to patreon.com/JamesWJesso. It's like a monthly tip, and you can give as little as $2 or ideally just the price of a cup of coffee once a month. And depending on how much you how much you pledge, enters you into certain things. So patreon.com/JamesWJesso, great way to support the show financially, or you can head to PayPal or a crypto donation. Links are in the description here. So here is my Psychedelic Cafe on the Australian acacia trees. And the people who are featured in this discussion will introduce themselves as a part of the thing. So I won't introduce them here. But please enjoy this Psychedelic Cafe on Adventures Through the Mind. And thank you for forgiving me for my less than amazing intro on this particular episode. So enjoy. All right, welcome everyone to the Psychedelic Cafe. This is a structured conversation that flows through 3 rounds plus an intro. The rounds will be explained at each sort of entry point to the round, and it is all surrounding a question. And I'll introduce the question in a second, but first, let's do a round and introduce ourselves. So the circle will move in the direction based on how everyone is on my screen, starting with myself, Julian, Nick, Rohan, Liam, and Jef. So just remember your order, and I'll start with myself. My name is James Jesso. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm here because I'm hosting this, and I want this conversation to happen. And so, Julian.
My name's Julian Palmer. I first smoked DMT 21 years ago from Australian Acacia, and I got fairly into helping to create culture in Australia related to the Acacia, and have been facilitating groups for 18 years, and have a strong familiarity with a lot of the acacia species and been doing a lot of research with them for many years.
So I just go?
Yep, go for it.
All right, my name's Nick Sun. I am a unrepentant plant slave, and I just really love the acacias. I've worked with them not for as long, maybe about 3, 4 to 5 years, and they've really changed my life, and I feel that they're really important plants to share with people. And I facilitate groups, and then I quit in between facilitating groups so I don't go to jail. So I don't do anything.
Tough act to follow. My name's Rohan. I first met the acacias several years ago, about four and a bit years ago, when I was a Neanderthal miner in Western Australia, destroying the earth, and had a wonderful encounter that really changed the course of, I guess, the whole direction of my life and my family, and and community around that. So these days I'm doing some facilitation work, a lot of one-on-one introductions with people to these beautiful trees that we have in this country. And yeah, I'm just a huge fan of these trees and what they've given me and those around. It's just a privilege to constantly witness miracles happening and big changes occurring in people's lives.
Hey, I'm Liam Engel. I'm a drug researcher from Edith Cowan University, and I'm kind of keen on all plants, especially plants that contain drugs, and acacia is like the iconic Australian one of those. But I've done some work on like acacia conservation projects, and the kind of intersection between that and people that use DMT, I think is really interesting.
All right, okay, next. My name's Jef. I'm Sydney chapter lead for the Australian Psychedelic Society. I have a bunch of Facebook pages I admin and mod, including my own passion project, Entheogenic Anthropology, which kind of arose out of my honours thesis on ayahuasca and deep ecology, which I finished in 2015. And that kind of acted as a strange attractor to bring that medicine into my life. And after that, I just became, fascinated with acacia and just learned absolutely as much as I possibly could about it and just devoured every piece of information and spent hours and hours in the bush just learning out in the field. So, yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to jump into the second stage of this, the first stage of this conversation, where we will share one clear, coherent thought towards the central question of this cafe. And I'll go last in this circle, just so I'm not priming the conversation. The question is, where do the Australian psychoactive acacia species fit into the contemporary local psychedelic scene? And how does interaction with these species inform a deeper connection to this land and its dreaming?
All right. So I'd say that because Australia has the acacias growing and Australia has a good climate, Australia has quite a good scene of people growing plants and using plants. Say somewhere like Europe, there's no potent psychoactive plants that you can go out into the bush and harvest from. So in Australia, beginning even in the late 80s, I know someone who was harvesting acacia in the late 80s, and especially from the mid 90s, people have been extracting DMT from these acacias and drinking the tea from them, having that unique communication and perspective. And many people might have the viewpoint that DMT is simply a chemical molecule and that's all it is. But I think a lot of us would agree that when you work with these acacias, they talk to you, they communicate with you, and these are not hallucinations. That each acacia has its own character, its own personality. It has its own unique perspective. So one acacia species is very different to the next one, and they all have very different personalities. And you can learn from them. They can teach you stuff and show you how they live, how they understand reality. So I think, in terms of deeper connection to the land and the dreaming, that's huge. But what I find with people is people do get these sort of personal coaching sessions with these acacia species sometimes if you drink it in a tea. And so it's often really helping people to be better people and allowing them to work through these issues. There's a lot of emphasis on the plant teachers like ayahuasca especially, but I like to work with certain acacia species in Syrian rue, for example, which is perhaps one of the most primary medicines that I use and one of the most effective. And then you can really listen to the acacias speak to you and hear what they have to say. And they can give a very impartial, direct feedback about who you are and how you're living as a human being. And that the characteristics of the personality of the acacia is very much like Australia. There's a lot of light, there's a lot of clarity, there's a lot of spaciousness, and there's a lot of humor as well. There's a kind of a certain kind of laid back characteristic. You know, there's one acacia called Acacia obtusifolia. I call the VB of DMT, which is like a VB is a very Australian beer because it's so macho. It's so like intense and masculine and macho that it's got the characteristics of, you know, within, you know, you can pick it within white Anglo culture. So I remember I took a tea from Acacia obtusifolia once from the phyllodes, and it really told me how the landscape of Australia was imprinted within the white Anglo, the white European population, who's the predominant people who live in Australia, how the characters of the land have influenced people in Australia. So, yeah, I think it really helps people to get insight that is non-human, that it's not coming from the human field. And people are innately receptive to that because just like the shaman is like traditionally on the edge of the village and he has no affairs in the human world, the plant has no agenda at all. You know, if it's willing to communicate with you, you get a very clear message that is not tainted by any agenda. So I think there's a lot of potent uniqueness to the experience of connecting to the acacia specifically.
Yeah, I guess I feel like these plants are an expression of the environments they grow in, and one of the tenets of herbalism is that whatever illnesses afflict the land, the sort of cure will lie in the plants of the land. So I think there's a certain resonance that acacias have with people who live on this land that traditional ayahuasca brews won't necessarily have. And I find that traditional ayahuasca brews are often quite strict. They've got this, you know, a lot of ceremony and this sort of serious vibe. And I find the acacias are a lot more laid back. And I feel the Australian character, we're a very young culture. We have no really traditions, and we don't really have any. I feel like people taking DMT who have no background in spiritual traditions, this is like their entry point into connecting to a deeper sort of spiritual fabric that is resonant on pretty much, I guess, one of the oldest unchanged land masses on this planet. So, and also it's just availability. You can't really get chacruna as easily here as you can get acacia. And from my experiences with the differences of ayahuasca, traditional ayahuasca brews and the acacia brews, there's just something that's, for me at least, deeply more preferable in the Australian acacia brews because, I don't know, there seems to be a lot more clarity. They're a lot more high vibration, and they're a lot more grounded as well. I think it's because they're a tree and not a sort of a bush like chacruna, so that they seem to be on equal footing with the ayahuasca, even though the ayahuasca does guide the acacias. I feel like when you do take a Syrian brew and acacia brew, for example, you just get the full character of the acacia, and you just get this spaciousness that is not in the more jungly sort of brews, I guess. So yeah, for me at least, it was definitely a deep connection to the vibrational field of this land, and I don't think you could get that from any other plant really that wasn't growing on here. Yeah,
I would have to agree with Nick there, and that it's sort of like the idea of the doctrine of signatures, and that the shape of the plants almost reflects the type of experience or the nature of the experience. Acacias have this deep taproot, and they often root really deep into big rocks and hang off the side of cliffs, or they can grow out in the desert and really expansive open skies. And so that sort of also shapes the qualitative feel of the different acacia experiences. As obviously there's an energy signature in the land that's being exuded through the plant itself, its spirit, and the neurotransmitter it's carrying. I think also, even given the 30, 40 years of experimentation that Julian's acknowledged, it still feels like we're in a very nascent stage with acacia. It's almost like a preteen, early teen stage, that there's so much more to discover, so many more, I believe, active species out there. But it's sort of like the more people drink particular acacias in this country, the more a sort of collective field seems to open up with that particular species, and the more communicative it becomes, the more people drink it. So it's evolving with us. And the reason I say nascent is because we do have to kind of acknowledge the speculative but most likely indigenous use that could go back 60,000 years of interaction with these species. I mean, there's no Western evidence, but most people have had experiences that affirm that that's definitely the case.
Oh, sorry, you go, Rohan.
No, you go. No, Liam, go.
Oh, all right, gosh. Well, I don't know if I'm following topic, but the thing that I wanted to talk about and draw attention to, and kind of the meaning that acacia has made me kind of consider and address, is this issue of conservation, which I think is kind of outside Lophophora or peyote. There's not really a whole lot of psychedelic conservation issues that are going on. And, you know, maybe there are that I'm not aware of, and presumably there will be more to come. So I think it's an interesting kind of site for learning more about this, especially because the peyote conservation issue is super contextual, hard to really understand without being there. And I live here, so I can have an opportunity to try to understand it from this angle. And then I guess the thing that it's like the perspective I have on it also, or at least what I want to talk about, changes depending on my audience. And this is like more of a kind of intimate spoken word setting, which is a bit different to something that you might write on a pamphlet and then send out on the internet. And given that context, I kind of would like to reflect a bit on the conservation pamphlet that we made for acacia, because we were worried about wild harvesting of some vulnerable species, and the difference between the message that gives and maybe the message that I want to talk about with you guys if we had an opportunity to talk directly and more privately about it. And so some of the things, I've got a list here of like different issues that we were conflicted over in trying to make this pamphlet. And the first is we don't even name the acacia that we're worried about because we don't want to draw more attention to it. But also that's not typical harm reduction approach, which is something I'm heavily in favour of because we're withholding information. We also talk about discouraging people from any wild harvest, even if it's, fallen phyllodes or seed. And the irony is wild harvest of seed was actually necessary to conserve this species in the first place, even though that was illegal. But, there is sufficient cultivated seed now not to need to do it anymore. And if we tell people that it's okay sometimes, then if everyone went to do it, then it would be bad. But, more conflict. We didn't talk about an alternative source for acacia, so we didn't talk about potentially being able to use Phalaris as a maybe more sustainable source, just because it's more difficult to manufacture out of it. And then if we're talking about manufacture, we're in a whole other political game besides harm reduction for the consumer. We consulted with National Parks and Wildlife Service, and they were really discouraging us from having anything about cultivation or harvest, and taught me something which I didn't know, that to grow some of these species, you're supposed to have a license. So like there's more of these plants growing in people's gardens now than are actually growing in the wild. So people are saving this plant, but it's technically illegal. And it's kind of ironic that the people that are caring for the plant are telling you not to grow the plant, but also thanks for caring the plant. Like it's a mess. More pharmacologically kind of interesting stuff was trying to explain contraindications around MAOI, different types of MAOI, like A, B, selective, irreversible, these super complicated concepts with complicated implications for what you're taking the drugs with. Trying to explain that to a layperson in a way that lets them mix their drugs is really hard. Also, it's interesting that acacia kind of extracts seem to have longer lasting effects than synthesized DMT. Another interesting thing that we kind of had to describe when we were talking about the effects as distinct from DMT. The issue of cultural appropriation, and like the easiest way to refer to like DMT plus MAOI is ayahuasca, because everyone knows what that means, but instantly people are like, that only means the vine or whatever. And the one other issue I had is that was not so relevant, but it's something I think is interesting to reflect on, and I'd like to know more about is, so obviously there are these acacias that we are trying not to wild harvest from because we're worried for their status. Obviously in Australia we have acacia that, are really prolific, and harvesting some here or there probably isn't a huge threat, but I have no idea how to create these rules in a way we could disseminate to everyone and say, yeah, you can do this, it's cool, it's not going to create any issues. So like, how do we sustainably wild harvest common acacia? I wish there was a clear answer to
that. So yeah, reflections on acacias in a modern usage context, I guess, of culture, particularly within Australia. It's just really interesting timing. There's been people obviously researching and working with these plants in this country for, at least 25 plus years. And as Jef mentioned, traditionally, indigenously, it could go back, to day dot. But that a lot of the information and access to information from either of those spheres is hard to come by. A lot of the older community is very tight knit, quite cliquey, and they've been doing their thing for long enough and have their own version of how the acacias kind of work within their lives. But now we have this like re-emerging interest that's coming through this third wave of psychedelic use, and a lot of people are now finding out about these psychoactive substances and getting really interested. And obviously there's a lot of famous plants, household names that we all know and understand have catalyzed some big change in people's lives. But to a large degree, I think publicly the acacias are kind of lesser known. Even within this country, it's still a very small kind of circle and scene that, has spent a lot of time researching and drinking and smoking these plants more recently. And I think in terms of the traditional or, the indigenous kind of use of these things, even in the here and now, it's very much, secretive and inaccessible information to most of us. We're white. And it's not our culture, it's not our tradition, and it's really none of our business. And I think given the track record of our country and how we've, treated their culture and their practices, particularly leading towards the sacred and business which isn't ours, I wouldn't expect that much of that information will translate. So it's kind of left the acacias in a really interesting situation, I find, where there's not so much a traditional usage of it, and I think it's something that's still being mapped and created and growing with Australia and with people that are working with it. And I see that as being like hugely important and really, really relevant to, I guess, the timing of what's happening on the planet and more particularly what's been happening within Australia over the past year or so. We've had a lot of, we had the bushfires, we've had a lot of calamity really, and it's kind of given us time to reflect on the vulnerabilities of nature and our place within it. So I think right now, I find the timing, super interesting, that the acacias, could potentially play a big part and in people's journeys of reconnecting to aspects of themselves and community and nature. And it's a real beauty, because a lot of the other plants, from around the world are so steeped in traditional usage and custom and ceremony. Whereas with the acacias, we kind of have a bit of a, open market here, and people can be a little bit more experimental, and there's lots of various angles into it. And I think most importantly, they're unfiltered. Like the teacher is the acacias. There's no shaman, there's no healer, and not to say that those kind of roles aren't significant or needed in some contexts, but for the most part, you've got this real pure experience to just experience these plants and to be led and guided. And what I've noticed, within my own journey, it completely flipped my concept of my own spirituality, my connection with the world around me, with my family, with my friends, with nature. I kind of had a really faith-based spirituality, for most of my life prior to engaging with these acacias. And, now my spirituality is completely experiential, which is a huge difference. And I'm really noticing with people that are kind of stepping in, there's this new wave of interest in a lot of, I suppose, greenhorns that don't know anything. So we have this beautiful opportunity to, introduce people to these plants, and hopefully, with a good network and support of each other. And there's, some great people that are heavily invested in this work. There's this opportunity of setting up some really good foundational understandings and knowledge, and answer, the questions that we can, in the hope that as people go forward in their journeys with these plants, they might have more knowledge and be equipped with a little more consideration than perhaps I was, or people 15 years before me, etc. So, and really, I think the big take home, how it could relate to the culture or the spirituality attached to the land and dreaming. Look, the acacias they're quite different to many of the other plants. They're very cosmic. They communicate a lot. And experientially, I kind of feel, and I notice with many people, it's the lessons aren't kind of given or told like a lot of other kind of plant, teachers and experiences kind of go. With the acacias, it's like a self-generated kind of understanding. It's like they lead you to the knowledge, but the eureka moment comes from within, and you kind of start understanding and reprogramming things through your own discovery. It's not an absolute sit down, shut up and listen kind of experience. And I think it's, that alone is super empowering for people, and they start to realize very quickly that they have the ability to kind of navigate these spaces and this work, fairly autonomously. So it's kind of, we've got this beautiful opportunity to hopefully support people in their journeys and get them working with these plants, on their own, growing them, enjoying them. And I think how that kind of relates to like maybe the larger picture of where Australia's at right now, and all of these issues that we have with the Indigenous culture not fully being integrated or, really acknowledged at this point. I see the acacias being a big part, because they, generally connect us to ourselves more and to our own spiritual natures or broader selves. And the connectivity to the rest of humanity, and obviously to nature. So when people are drinking the acacias from, the land that they live on, it's very relevant. And I think it starts to kind of plant these seeds of, understanding and empathy. And then all of a sudden, I just see the guards coming down and the social conditioning kind of dissipating, and we kind of come to more of an honest space. And I think from that place, we can reflect a little bit better on how we could go forward in maybe healing what is the new Australia to, the older Indigenous version of this land that's been here, as long as anything else. So Yeah, they're hyper relevant right now. And just like any kind of witchcraft or herbalism, I really feel like it's important for people to be working with the plants and the medicines that are most local to them, because they typically are what's needed for them. So yeah, acacias in this country, we've got so much more work to do and so much more to learn. But I think it's definitely getting to a point now where a lot of people are stepping into this work and stepping out of the shadows and becoming really available just to kind of see, what can come of it all.
My experience with acacia smoked in the form of changa is not insignificant, but my experience drinking acacia is just the once, but like twice over the course of 2 days. So my actual sort of like how deep I am in the understanding of the lived experience of acacia is almost nothing. And similarly for my sense of what's happening there in Australia, almost nothing. But what I do understand is that there's something very rich and very interesting happening there, and in particular there, as in where y'all are in Australia. That when I was there in 2019, before all planes disappeared from the airs, that I got a chance to see, which is this emerging culture that exists there, that is a spirituality culture, a psychoactive culture that feels very, very uniquely Australian, and is based in the drinking of psychoactive native plants that, other than the possibly occulted indigenous history, there's no history of these plants being drunk at all. So if we go based on that, then this is a brand new phenomenon, and it's also something that seems to be so just very rich from an anthropological perspective. I was like, this is incredible, and nobody's talking about this, and it like, except in Australia. And so I had this deep curiosity to explore the topic more deeply, which is why I called this cafe together, and is likely why I'll be more of a listener than a contributor. So that's the end of the first stage of the conversation. We're going to get into the second one, and it'll probably last for about 45 minutes or so, up to an hour. And in this stage of the conversation, it's pretty free form. We can we can respond to each other. We can basically say whatever. We can say what's not being said. We can total non sequiturs. We can respond to each other, always speaking into the circle. And I will let you know, and anyone can speak at any time, and I'll let you know when this part of the conversation is done. So here we go.
Got a question? Oh, sorry, we've gone at the same time. All right. Well, my question is, how many, if any of you have experiences or heard of people who have just consuming like bulk acacia material with no MAOI component? Experiences with that?
Well, it's a shame Nick Tree's not here. He's the man to answer that, because apparently there is endemic, very micro-endemic species that is orally active. And it has been drunk by quite a few people in Australia.
But just with that species?
As far as most of us understand, yeah. I think there has been trace harmless found in various species like obtusifolia and little tiny, spots in acuminata, but not enough to make it orally active. And again, this season variations could have a huge effect on how orally active it is. But there are also native MAOIs around as well.
Yeah, there's also Acacia complanata, which has some obscure MAOs in it. And Mulga, who had a website I think starting in the mid-90s. He did a little bit of research on it, and I found a few stands, and I haven't done much research on it. But I did meet a Aboriginal man who told me that the reason why you have ceremonies at certain times of the year, and this is like kind of verbatim what he said, is because the constituents in the wattle that activate that activate the DMT in the wattle are only produce those alkaloids at certain times of the year. So generally, a lot of the acacias are very, very seasonal, and we don't know why they produce DMT. Like there's a very good relaying of all the various acacias that Snoo gave at Tyringham Hall. I think it's like, is it?
ESPD 50.
Yeah, ESPN. And
Google search for psychoactive drugs.
Yeah. And he really highlights in that, going through each acacia, how seasonally, most acacias just might produce DMT one time a month, but we don't know because, going out and testing them, which is something that I do sometimes as a kind of a hobby, like it's a thankless task and it's very slow, and you don't, it costs a lot of money, and you don't get anything out of it, and it's very slow learning. So there's so much research to be done. And there's MAOs also in Acacia obtusifolia. And I knew a guy who was just getting effects by grinding up 5 grams of root bark and putting him in gel caps. And that was like medicine for him. So, yeah.
I've also heard Acacia acuminata, if you take it in large quantities, like 100 grams, apparently you get like an hour to 2 hour long sort of effect. That's what I've heard. And I've heard some completely unsubstantiated rumors that apparently an elder communicated to one of my friends that the Noongar people would use it to find answers to questions. So I don't know if there's something in that, but I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, well, acuminata also has a symbiotic relationship with a very, very, very sacred MAOI containing tree, which I won't mention the name of, which is, held with utter reverence, almost fear. And they have this symbiotic relationship growing together in the same place. So it's highly unlikely Indigenous people did not know about that and make full utility of it.
Well, I know you can take the acacia confuser bark in large doses, and that's active without any MAOI. So I'm sure there might be some kind of relational parallel.
Also Mimosa hostilis, but you need to do a cold water extraction from the Mimosa hostilis, like 20 grams apparently. Just soak it in water, and that's orally active, apparently.
Yeah, so I've been a bit lazy with it, but been meaning to conduct a bit of citizen science based on a bit of intel that the acacias gave to a friend that told them that because they were rhesus negative blood type, they didn't need inhibitors. So we ended up following through and did an experiment and gave this person a normal dose of, what one would drink of the acacia without the MAOI. And yeah, sure enough, full-fledged experience, as long as expected and as visceral. So I've had a chat to a few different people about this, and apparently it is a bit of a phenomena. And I know a couple of other people that have actually been working like this, kind of doing rhesus negative type groups. So I think there's a little bit to explore in that as well, potentially.
It's a very exclusive club.
Yeah, it's rare.
Alien DNA,
Something that I'm wondering about is DMT has been mentioned multiple times, but then so has a discussion about how acacia seems to be different in a way. And I understand that there's discussion about other tryptamine alkaloids that are inside acacia that are not DMT that might also be psychoactive and contributing to it. And I'm wondering if anyone here has more information on that.
Yeah, I think one of the most obvious ways that reveals itself is when people are extracting DMT and it comes out really oily. It won't crystallize. Often that's monomethyltryptamine, which has been a few experiments on by itself with differing effects. Some say it's active, and others say it's not. I believe it's part of what gives the cuminata a much softer feel, a much sort of earthier, grounded feel. Is that it's a much less visual and more somatic. If you look at the Wikipedia page of psychoactive acacias, there's about 15 listings for tentative findings of 5-MeO-DMT. About, I think, a third of those have now been, redacted, but amended as, I don't know, some experimental anomaly or lab mistake, tainted samples. But yeah, there is definitely a possibility that some contain 5-MeO, and at some stages of some acacias, it really does feel like there's that touch of 5-MeO in there.
There's also NMT. There's a very good talk by this character called Nick Tree, and he talks about that being a spatial hallucinogen. And I think that definitely there's something in that.
In Acacia obtusifolia, I know there was a test done in the Netherlands years ago, and they found 7% 5-MeO-DMT. There's been other tests on Acacia obtusifolia, and they find all these unidentified alkaloids. And so it appears that there's many of these alkaloids that are unidentified, and some people hypothesize that the Acacia obtusifolia has alkaloids in it that are, might be active, in the milligram, in the microgram range, that they're that powerful, and that some people say that they're even more potent than DMT. So years ago, like in the 90s, say in Europe, if you came across the really waxy DMT, the really resiny stuff, that was always from the acacia, and that was the most sought after extract in Europe, especially in the Netherlands, that would get the highest price, and that was really happening in the mid-90s, that people were getting it there. And so that stuff has become quite legendary because it's something else is happening that is not DMT that seems even more magical than DMT. So this seems unique to Acacia obtusifolia. And one time I extracted from some root bark from these big tubers from these trees that fire would come by every few years and would basically fire would destroy all the trees, but the tubers would remain. So you had these giant tubers like this thick. So you could there was a massive network of these tubers and heaps of trees coming out of the tubers. So you could just take a little bit of the, you could take a tuber and the trees are fine, and take some root bark off these tubers. So the extract from those tubers, it came out that when you smoked the DMT, you had the regular sort of experience that was 10, 20 minutes, but then you would have something like a light mushroom experience that would last 6 to 8 hours. But it wasn't a mushroom experience, it was an acacia experience. So they give you an idea of like how, what a chemical factory these trees can be and how mysterious and how much to learn about, why they're producing these alkaloids, because, science doesn't understand why plants create alkaloids. Like, we don't even understand why coca has cocaine in it, why ephedra has ephedrine in it. And it's an even bigger mystery when it comes to the acacias, and a massive mystery when it comes to Acacia obtusifolia. Like, why is it producing that chemical that produces like a 6-hour experience in people that obviously is so unique that the brain can't recognize it? And so it's like mushrooms. You have this 6-hour experience. So yeah, there's incredible amount to learn about these trees and the alkaloids.
Yeah, because I mean, most mainstream science would say that yes, to ward off predators, but I don't know what much use to the tree it is to have a bird have a 6-hour acacia experience, or a possum or something.
Well, because then I would realize that it was
neurotransmitters.
Well, I mean, aren't these tryptamines generally, they're non-toxic to humans anyways, but like, do birds die if they get a tryptamine? I mean, I feel like the suggestion that it's just, a defense mechanism, I think it's just is human ignorance to assume that, like, these plants, like, the only things they have going for them is trying to live or trying not to die, right? Like, it's that simple, it's that primitive, and that being unable to recognize that, although, I mean, maybe some of us here, having had direct biochemical interactions with those plants, would say that they have a rich inner life without us that they can share with us, but there's a general recognition that there is no rich inner life to species that aren't human, right? And so it would just boil down to what is most obvious, like, well, obviously it wants to live, so whatever's in there must be to protect it from dying or to help it living. And then just to, like, chalk that up, be like, that's it, we know it.
It's a very unholistic view.
Well, I mean, maybe there is no, specific reason. There could just be this sort of active play maybe involved. It's like, why do butterflies flutter around the way that they do, completely aimlessly? Like, maybe there's just, I don't know, a sense of universal play in some of these acacias. I was reading also this, I'm going to be like paraphrasing this article very badly, but it was Stephen Howard Buhner exploring the role of psilocybin in the ecosystem. And he said that basically, if I get this right, don't quote me on it, but the trees of the local ecosystem also take the mushrooms, and it creates novel new connections within the ecosystem somehow, and creates like novelty basically within the ecosystem, arising in new sort of connections and sort of I don't know, permutations of the sort of thing. And there's this friend of ours that we all know who asked the plants, so why do you guys have DMT? And he said that all these letters appeared out in front of him, and it just said communication. So I think that's a pretty interesting communication there from the acacias.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's very much felt in many of my journeys with acacia that it's like an interface. I've used this analogy a few times now, where it's like DMT is like the operating system, and each acacia is like a different browser. It'll give you access to sort of different realms of knowledge and different spaces, but they're all sort of operating on top of this underlying program that is DMT. And sometimes I've been able to sort of distinguish what is the DMT part of the experience and what is the acacia characteristic to that, and where they fit in with each other. And it seems to be multi-layered to me.
Yeah, I think like, once people start working with these plants and all the various acacia species, individually, and you rack up few hundred hours in the tank, so to speak, you really do start to understand, I guess, the qualitative, or the, however subjective, but the experiential differences between each of the acacias and, I guess, their regions, and like the West Coast versus the East Coast, and all the various personalities, and I find it's pretty consistent, within my own experience and many others, of how these plants show up within their experiences. There seems to be strong personalities at play with very different agendas, or different messages, that I think, can definitely be somewhat separated from the typical DMT, experience or realms, which is the beauty of these acacias, which I suppose a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to experience themselves, is just, how different they are. And I always find it interesting when I, speak to people that are smoking changa or DMT, and, you kind of ask them about their experience, and you kind of like, okay, you try and work out what it might have been extracted from. But, like, most people don't have any idea where their DMTs come from, or which tree the DMT has been extracted from in their blend. And I think we're kind of getting to a point where that's really lazy, and hopefully people bust out of just like, I got changa, great, full stop, that's it. Hopefully they'll start to kind of want to explore more, of the experience itself, and the source of that experience. But I guess that kind of bleeds into some murky territory, maybe even with what Liam's, working with, and the conservation side, because, how much knowledge or information should be imparted to people relatively new, to, prevent harm of the environment through, terrible harvesting, etc. But then at the same time, like, that education might be paramount to the survival of these things. So, what do you guys feel about, just in general, the course for how important education is to, people coming into acacia work?
I feel like it's so important, but I have no idea what the actual education I need to impart is. Like, I feel obviously there needs to be some systems in place that manage acacia, other plants, natural resources in general on a global scale, but we're just so far behind managing even people like that, let alone plants, let alone anything. And, I don't want to be all pessimistic, but that's kind of where I end up getting stuck, and not knowing what I need to be able to say or do. And like, I feel like I have been enlisted by, acacia, other plants. And it's like, first I project my, human-centric way of thinking onto them. It's like, all right, like we were saying before, you're a plant, you need to survive, I need to help you survive. But then, like, how do I choose which one of these plants gets my attention to help it survive? And then why am I choosing one of these plants and not another plant? And it's, maybe that's a cool thing about the psychedelic experiences. Sometimes it gives you, a path or a way forward when you otherwise couldn't find one. And I guess, I feel education is so important. I'm so lost on what the message is beyond being mindful, that I hope that we work it out.
I also think there's a real case for two parallel research projects. We could call it the varieties of acacia experience. One being a completely qualitative, where you say do a thematic analysis on various phrases, terms, words, colours, and match them with different species, but also a purely hard science, mass spectrometry, sort of chromatography analysis of those species and their constituent alkaloids at different times of the year. And perhaps with the end goal of merging the two. So it's a pretty huge endeavour, and I don't know who's got the time and the resources to carry that out.
I think compiling Erwood and other psychedelic forum experience reports based on species would be a pretty easy and useful project. Even without doing the analysis of it, anyone could be like, hey, obtusifolia is the one I have access to and I'm thinking of trying. I could read through those experience reports rather than just a DMT report or just or an Acuminata report.
And you get a thematic analysis program just to run through the entire nexus to pick out species.
Totally. I'd read the whole thing anyway. It'd be fascinating. I just don't bother to do all the copy and pasting.
Yeah, it's a real rabbit warren. There's plenty of tunnels to go down.
I guess a lot of people who are watching this don't know that Australia is actually two separate countries. There's like the East Coast and West Australia. And and it's quite a long way. So most of us don't get a chance to go over there often. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the situation in WA, because for what I've heard and seen over the years, there's a lot of, because there are populations of Acacia acuminata quite close to Perth, that there are places where you've just got this, it looks like vandalism, where people have just gone in with an axe and they've ring-barked trees and taken a little tiny bit and then done that to another tree. And then you've got this sort of crazy situation where I've heard there's even cameras on population stands of trees as well. I've heard that. Maybe you can confirm or deny that. I'm not sure, but I it does seem to me that the culture in WA, that maybe there's more people doing DMT in WA, that DMT is maybe more mainstream in WA because it's just the Acacia acuminata is just quite relatively common there. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that.
In terms of what I've heard of the scene, I don't live in WA, but I have a bit of an understanding of it. I have heard reports of people monitoring populations to prevent, them being harvested. Also, what I found is so disgusting. You're right. There are these huge acuminata populations everywhere. You go into the botanical gardens, and the bloody acuminata in the botanical gardens are stripped. Like, come on, mate, that is so lazy. You had to go to the one that had a sign on it. Like, they're just everywhere here. But in terms of the scene, like, I'm not super deep in it, but I haven't got the impression it's any more prominent there. I think there's, some communities that have access to shitloads of stuff, but I don't think it's catching on quite the same. I see a big part of it as being tied in with kind of like, doof, psytrance kind of culture. That seems to be a channel a lot of this stuff gets distributed, and I don't think that channel is quite the same in WA.
No, I was there for several years, and a lot of Western Australia is mining and resources and big industrial complex type situations. So a lot of guys doing shift work, a lot of time to listen to podcasts, a lot of Joe Rogan. Like, yeah, what's this DMT shit, mate? And because we all used to get drug tested all the time. It's like you smoke crack or you drink alcohol or shit. Maybe we try and figure out how to get our hands on some DMT. So I think a lot of my experience, getting into the plants, like there wasn't really much helpful information. I mean, I was able to navigate it through the various forums, the beautiful Australian forums and resources that we've got. But I'm not going to say for the simple mind, but for the working man with the family and he's doing 60 hours a week, he's not going meticulously through these forums and researching or really giving a shit, because essentially their whole position or everyone's beginning, I believe, in their journey of psychedelic exploration is very self-centric, like, well, what can I get out of this experience and how do I get it? And there's a lot of casualty potentially, as to how that kind of eventuates for people. So I'd see it time and time again. I mean, people would just do dumb shit. And it wasn't because they're heartless pricks. I think, a lot of them would end up getting getting taught through the experience itself. I'd hear a lot of bad trip reports where I think the plants kind of, had their way with certain people, but it was just the lack of accessible, clear, decisive, easy information. So, the little that I knew back then, I'd try and kind of impart that on people just so they would kind of understand as much as possible. But in a place like WA, where there's, literally from the gold fields, 600 Ks east to Perth, it's just littered with acuminata. So most of those people are out lobbing trees every weekend for their firewood. So, the acuminata is just another one. So I think in terms of just their general awareness of the environment and conservation, it's a mining state. Look at how that place operates. It's environmentally destructive. So, they're a really interesting kind of demographic of acacia users that I think really don't want to be doing the wrong thing, but probably don't know how else to go about it. And because there isn't a very strong community there, even in the psychedelic scene, it's just the odd dude on his own sharing with his mates or whatever, or it's, serious kind of medicine, type circles, which most of those Aussie, miners don't really fit in and wouldn't be caught dead at an ayahuasca retreat. So, yeah, there's definitely some room, I guess, to kind of bring some palatable education information that might kind of, change the behavior and the way that people are doing things. Because it just seems like, the plants are trying and they're wrapping people over the knuckles here and there, but we as the community and people that I guess are working with these plants, I suppose the onus is on us. And I guess like the way that I work with people, I try and take the responsibility straight off me as soon as I engage with them. And I give them as much information as I possibly can. So the onus is now on them. And I think, for me, quite early with these plants, my journey with them, it began as my own, like, me, give me this, I need this, I want that. And then, the plants just kind of flipped that and said, oh, this is great, like this is a one-sided relationship now. So, what are you doing for us? So this question kind of emerged like, ask not what the plants can do for me, but what can I do for the plants? So now it's kind of a part of my ethos to shove that down other people's throats a little bit, just so they're a little bit more accountable to their own process of journey. And look, people are going to make mistakes. They're going to hurt some plants. But I suppose I'd hope for every tree that's been ringbarked by someone that maybe within a couple of years they're planting up 10 or something, So yeah, there's space to kind of really develop something here for all of us, I guess.
I think that encouraging people to grow is obviously absolutely critical to all of this. But one thing a lot of people don't seem to realize, and I've had this confirmed by perhaps about half a dozen people, is that phyllodes seem to be active from day dot on an acacia. It's not this 5-7 years for alkaloid maturity like you would with a vine or some other plants. They're pretty much active as soon as they start appearing. And perhaps if more people knew that, they would be more inclined to grow them. But it seems to be that people go straight to Facebook for their questions now. They're not going to the Nexus. They're not even aware of the Nexus, but they're going to these DMT pages with 2 million, subscribers, followers or whatever, and just expecting, all the answers to be handed to them on a platter. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's me being old and cynical.
Yeah, the thing about the phyllodes is, say, with the broad phyllodes Acacia cuminata, there can be like a lot of variability in the alkaloids. So I think I assume that's why people generally have gone for the bark. And if you drive 3 hours east of Perth, you get the narrow phyllodes, which basically the narrow phyllodes, there's so much of that growing. It's more in the deserty region of the state. So it's like huge amount of land where it's growing. But if you go on a longer drive, the phyllodes from the narrow phyllodes acuminata appear to be much more pure DMT and a much higher yield as well. So, and you can't really take bark because there's not that much bark on it because they're smaller bushes trees. And because they're smaller bushes, you can harvest more phyllodes from them. It's just that people are lazy, and they go to the places where it's just an hour drive from Perth and don't want to go out. But if they did, the narrow phyllodes, I think, is much better. And also the Acacia obtusifolia phyllodes are a bit more variable there and less yielding, less high yielding than the bark, unfortunately. Though, I've had some great sessions with making tea from the phyllodes, which is you can do. But yeah, it's just a little bit more tricky. So there's no obvious answer as to what the best source is, but I encourage people. There are people selling the Acacia acuminata, broad phyllodes and narrow phyllodes, and you can generally find most people who sell that, and that's probably the most sort of sustainable source because there's quite a lot of it growing wild. It's unlikely people are going to deplete that resource anytime soon.
And there's also acuminata plantations, people that have sandalwood farms. Again, there's that symbiotic relationship between sandalwood and acuminata. You often find them growing together in plantations. So I think that's where probably the commercial acuminata bark that's sold online comes from. I think one of the sort of persistent myths that feeds into this idea that we need bark comes from Acacia confusa and the international market for Acacia confusa root bark. Yeah. So people just think, oh, root bark, I need root bark or bark, and they don't even think about phyllodes.
Maybe we need to insert laminated signs pointing this out in all the active populations of acacia all over Australia.
You need licenses from National Parks and Wildlife Service. It's ridiculous. They don't want you to protect their plants for free.
Well, we live in basically a very nice prison colony, so that's the way this country works. So you just don't really listen to that.
That brings up a question that I've been kind of holding, which is that none of you, as far as I understand, none of you are Aboriginal people, and so that you're all the descendants of the Australian, or like the English colonizers come to Australia, and yet all of you are very sensitive to Aboriginal issues. And so I'm curious where the practice and the growing culture, or where and what the practice and growing culture of drinking native acacias as a part of a spiritual practice, where does that fit into your own journey of recognizing that you come from a lineage of devastation and death, but also are working towards being in the world differently? I'm sorry if I put words in your mouth there, but that's my curiosity.
Firstly, as an English colonizer descendant,
sorry,
you racist, James. I'm actually 0.2% Native American according to my 23andMe genetic test. So that means that I have carte blanche to use these plants as much as I want and sell them on the internet, which I don't. But I think that's a really complicated issue. On my first acuminata journey, I actually got a very strong message from the plants: give me back to the indigenous people. And I was a bit evangelical, but then I realized the matter is actually much more complicated than that. You can't just go into the space and be like, hey guys, here is your plant. I realized that what we need to do is find bridges into those communities. It's a very traumatized space. The culture is still very young in Australia. Like when I was in America, I realized there was quite a lot more mixing because it was 500 years on from the colonial sort of devastation. So there was a lot more openness and intermixing between the Native American cultures and the colonizer cultures. So I think it's going to take a lot of time. And also, there's a shit ton of trauma in that space, and I think if I've heard certain stories from people who have been giving the medicine to indigenous people, and I mean that's a whole new field, and there's a lot of problems. Well, there's a lot of unknown variables there, and I hear that it's sometimes really amazing, and sometimes actually what comes up is really fucking full on, and there's some repercussions to that. So I think what needs to happen is we need to find bridges or links into that culture who can then, and that's not to say that they already are having these plants on some level, but it's just very hard to really navigate this space because it's still very new. So I think the message I got after that initial, hey, give me back to my people, because a lot of people report a lot of experiences of indigenous culture, even down to the visuals of the acacia. They'll report seeing like dreamtime, like geometrics, stuff like that. Yeah, so far it's like and a lot of people get this feeling of the pain in that space, but what to do about that, I think we're still trying to work that out. But I think for now, the best thing we can really do, in my opinion, is to just try and create bridges and let it happen naturally. Don't try and force it on anyone, because that's just another "I'll come save you" wounded native person type paradigm. That's a bit forceful and part of the dominated culture.
I think I have a very relevant anecdote. So I know of this like secret indigenous plant that gets you high. I want to know more about this plant. I find the people whose plant it is. I go and speak to them and I say, hey, like, this plant definitely gets you fucked up. People are doing it. We should know what's in it to make things more safe. And my kind of assumption was they were just going to be on board because that makes sense to me and how I think. But they were like, yeah, it's a secret. We don't care. Don't look into it anymore. And I'm like, all right, fair enough. I guess I just have to go with that if I'm being respectful. And when we talked about it a bit more with this like lawyer guy there, their main concern was around who would get to profit off it if we found a new substance in it. How can we assure that any money that would be coming out of it would definitely be being funneled back to these people? And we can't, so they don't want to do it. And so, like you were saying, Nick, I think it's a question of how do we make sure they get something out of it, which I think is how we build the bridge. And sadly to me, I feel maybe with some plant conservation stuff, but even with that, I haven't felt like that's built connection so much. But it's money, like find a way to financially benefit indigenous communities, and that's how you build the bridge, I think, which is kind of a bummer. But that's kind of what I feel like it boils down to.
I think intuitively and anecdotally, the use of acacia within indigenous populations is perhaps as limited as it is now within the Western population, probably reserved to select initiates, very, very powerful medicine, so kept very secret. You know, you need to pass through years and years and years of trial and, you know, ordeal to be initiated into even knowing about these plants. I mean, that's my feeling and what I've been told by a few other people. But, you know, I think in a way the acacia could even be an antidote, like most plant medicines are, to the sort of dominated consumer Western mindset. You know, I feel I learned more in the 5 years of consuming acacia than I did in, you know, the 4 or 5 years of studying indigenous worldviews and philosophy at university. It sort of confirmed those things, like the dream time and the idea of the spirits being in the land. I've physically experienced indigenous spirits rising out of the land wanting to speak. And the DMT sort of going, just go away, I'm working here. And then their voice coming back in, but then turning into the land. And you start understanding basically how the dream time works. That it is this, it's not this original creation myth. It's a sort of a timeless, ever unfolding concept. It's very non-linear. So I think it's an intuitive way to understand Indigenous worldviews.
I agree with Jef in many of those sentiments. I think in my own experiences and kind of just noticing shifts within the communities, particularly in Western Australia that I was working with. Originally I had the same question when I got into it, and I was quite aware and sensitive to the fact that we're using these sacred plants that aren't exactly our culture, and was that some form of horticultural appropriation, or was I allowed to be doing it? And so pretty quickly I kind of committed those questions into the space itself, and I believe this is a huge role of the plants themselves within the experience to reveal themselves and reveal the relevance to the individual of what they need to do in their own personal life to help to create change. And that might just be doing some volunteer work or reading a book, or it's because we've got such systemic trauma. This is nothing that one individual or one facilitator or one researcher is going to fix. It's too large a problem. But I think the healing for that culture and for our own is essentially replugging back into the dreaming, into that space. And I think this is what the acacias are here to do. And, I see it time and time again. This is what starts awakening in people. Once they've kind of gone through their own motions, it starts to become a lot more broader and communal and connected. These plants are all about connection and awareness, and they bring us this awareness. So the more aware we become, I guess the better equipped we are to kind of start to change our behaviors. And within that space, hopefully the domino effect kicks in, and with more of a collective awareness and change, then the possibility of those bridges that Nick was talking about, the structures will be there. It'll be easier to do instead of at the moment just pushing shit uphill because we're trying too hard. We're using the mind, and this is something that's it's so much more complex and beyond brain work.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like you can't impose it's a complex system, so you can't impose like I'm just sorry, I'm just going a bit spastic. But anyway, what did I want to say? I've lost it. I'll have to come back to it.
So, related to Indigenous culture, Australia was a culture of many different nations of people who had different languages, totally different culture, and a huge landmass. So I think there were some areas of Australia and some species of acacia that I don't think Australian Indigenous people ever used. And I think there are other places where we can be pretty sure, I think we've all got quite a few anecdotal stories, often direct from Australian Indigenous people, or have, drunk medicine that has ostensibly come from Indigenous people, to know that they did it. And also, we know enough that it is kind of secret, and that what I also know as well is that at least in one part of Australia, they do use it as initiation for all men and perhaps women. And also, they also have other psychoactive plants as well that are relatively unresearched. And I think it's interesting what Liam said. I think there often is this attitude of that they don't want to share what they know. But I also do know that there are parts of Australia where they have lost the knowledge of their plants, and they don't know which plants. They know their songs, but they don't know what plants they used. So I've recently become aware of this group of Indigenous people. So yeah, there is movement on the station for sure. Like me and Nick, and I know other people as well, are really definitely interested, but there's no easy way. There's no easy way. There's no job description you can get, And I have heard of one person who is giving ayahuasca to Aboriginal people in remote places in Australia, and a lot of people were really opposed to it because they didn't like what she was doing. They thought it was just too much trauma coming up, and it wasn't being dealt with very well. And a lot of people who were into ayahuasca and psychoactive plants they didn't like her attitude and how she was going about it and what it was bringing up. So I think it's a very delicate issue, but I do think there is a real way forward here. Perhaps that can help not just Australian people and Indigenous people, but people around the world to come to terms with an understanding of what this is really about and how this really works. And I think, there could be some, if there is an open acknowledgement of the use of psychoactive plants in Australian Indigenous culture, there could be a real way forward in helping us all to create a new global culture whereby it might be that, hey, if you want to be president of the United States, you've got to take the material. And I've heard this from several people. You've not just drink ayahuasca, you got to take the stuff that they do, which is like smoke DMT for 3 days. And I hear that's the initiation, that's the initiation dose. Smoke DMT for 3 days, and that's a technology that we don't yet have in the West. We have, I could barely conceive what that's like personally, but I'd love to take it, and I'm sure it irrevocably change your life as a human being, and you'd have a totally different orientation to the planet and the earth and your whole life. Like, imagine how you'd be coming out of that, So yeah, I think there's so much to explore here that's fascinating, but yeah, there's no easy way forward, but just being open and accepting the synchronicities and the signs, and trying to have that open these communication channels where it feels appropriate, because often, like Liam said, sometimes there's just there doesn't want to be a communication there.
I think it's going to take a lot of. Yeah, I think it's just going to take a lot of time and patience as well. I mean, I've got friends up here in the top end where I live, and they've spent 6 years up in the community living with these Indigenous folks, and they still will have some level of acceptance, but then they're completely cut off from like even the most basic sort of ceremonies and stuff like that, because obviously the trust has been so broken that they're very cagey about who they share this stuff with. But ironically, what I find these plants do is, if, in my opinion, I feel like whatever the Indigenous mindset it is, it seems to be a mindset based more on connection, and the Western, whatever you want to call, consumerist dominator mindset, that's based on separation. And what I find these plants seem to do is, like a lot of people on this forum have already said, is that they create more connection in ourselves and to the land. And so really these plants are almost helping us move away from that mindset into a more, I wouldn't say indigenous, but similar down that vein, a reconnection back to a similar sort of mindset like that, which is probably the best thing that could happen in view of what's going down right now, to help avert, if that's possible, or at least adapt to the shit fight that's going on right now. And just regarding like using these plants without sort of permission or stuff from indigenous cultures, like no offense to the indigenous cultures, but I also feel like the plants, that's kind of almost an anthropocentric point of view, that we have to have a human culture to mediate connection to these plants. I feel like everyone can sort of connect to these plants. There doesn't have to be necessarily a human culture connected to every plant. that's steeped in tradition. And I think that's also reflective of where we are as a people, as a nation of Australia. We basically have very little history. So I think it's only fitting that we now have a plant that doesn't necessarily have much history, at least, not necessarily connected to the indigenous, you know what I'm talking about. So that sort of connects to that as well.
I'm glad you mentioned permission there, because my understanding that is a hugely important thing in most indigenous cultures. And as Julian points out, that means some 300, 400 different language groups in this country, if not more. But permission is a huge thing to them. But I think even to the point where if I'm going out into the bush looking for acacias, I'll ask permission from the land, just between me and the land, because there isn't an indigenous person there to mediate for me.
Yep. I've had similar experiences. Like, I'll ask for permission and I'll get a very definite message when it's like, all right, that's enough. You can leave now. And you have to listen to that. Otherwise some shit will go down. And as long as you respect that, I feel like it's almost like they ring a little bell. Yeah.
You had that feeling. It's almost like this voice, time to go. Okay.
All right, that's enough. Get out. any more than that, then you're another dirty colonizer. So,
but I mean, those kind of experiences, I think, are exactly what was originally going on and still is with many different mobs and groups of the indigenous communities. I don't think, I view them, and my understanding of them is they're more custodians and caretakers that have an understanding, a really deep understanding of this mega ecology of interdimensional play that blends in its meta and fractal and physical and the whole gamut. But like Jef, with that kind of practice, I mean, I kind of follow the same thing, just intuitively aim my intention and my permission asking towards the plants or the land and the spaces that I'm in, because it's a vibrant ecology with things that go bump. And a lot of the knowledge, I think, and the practices of the indigenous cultures kind of circled around doing right by those energies and by the land and those kind of presences that you were describing. So, kind of mainlining into the source or the origin of a lot of those energies. And I really think that's a beautiful thing if people have that connection and that that experience. And I think it's the way forward, because I've got several friends that work in child protection, unfortunately, within heavily traumatized indigenous communities, and who are also medicine people too, and their understanding, and they've worked with a lot of the elders and these people for a long time, and they said sadly that there's many parts and aspects of the culture that's dying and slipping away, and obviously that's all to do with us and the history. And because of this deep trauma that currently exists within the emerging youth and the up and coming generations, there's not too many fitting people within their own community to pass on the mantle to, or some of this sacred knowledge. So what these people have reported to me is there's a real fear that this knowledge of plants and particular ceremony will die with these elders. So I guess it brings this new question into, well, where does that leave the rest of us, or any of us, in terms of how we, continue this work with these plants? So, I mean, for me, maybe much like you guys, it's learning by doing, intuition, and fucking making mistakes. I mean, some of the experience I had, out bush with the acuminatas in my early days were harrowing and very real and very disturbing. And they weren't human experiences, but boy, have they helped me to kind of change my practice or my understanding of the possibilities of what we're dealing with here, and that reverence is just it comes with the territory. So I think once people start experiencing these plants more, it's really up to the plants to kind of express this and reveal these things to people. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of that happening. So I can't speak for the broader DMT smoking community or drinkers, but yeah, the wheels are in motion. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, these are purely entheogenic plants. I mean, there's not much culture to, or tradition to draw on. So this is all self-discovery. And I think it's the more that we talk and share, the more we're all going to learn about what the fuck is possibly going on here,
I think, because I remember talking to you about that, Rohan, some of those experiences. And I think I remember just advising you to find your local elders and ask them about the stories of the place, because, the spirit of the land is in place. It's in that place. And I think we can also learn a lot about respect for these plants by learning the stories behind the places we're visiting, places we're going to find acacias at, and exploring. Just do a little bit of research into the traditional indigenous stories, because those stories are about the land. They are in the land.
I have a funny story where I learned about the stories of the land through the acacia. I was assisting at a retreat run by someone I won't name, and I was drinking certain acacia that grows on a certain mountain, and I was singing a song for the group, and I was just sort of improvising a song about the songline story that I knew of the area where the acacia grew in. And then a very tall black masculine spirit stood over my left shoulder and bent down like that and said, "You shouldn't be singing about that boy." And it scared the absolute shit out of me. I absolutely stopped. I was like, "I'm really sorry." And I gave it some tobacco, and he said, "Yeah, that's all right. Just don't fucking do that again." And then a few months later, I was talking to some other unrelated guy that I'd never met before, who was an avid acacia DMT smoker. And he was telling me about the tall ones, which were an Aboriginal spirit, the keepers of the law. They're very tall, black masculine spirits that basically tell you off when you haven't done the right thing. And I was like, holy shit, that's exactly what I encountered. And he said, well, yeah, that's what they do. And so that was a fairly interesting experience, I thought.
So I'm going to interject here. We have about 13 or so minutes before our scheduled end, but if you are willing to go over time a little bit, I have a question that might stimulate quite a bit of conversation, but I can hold it. So can I get a solid no from anyone who doesn't want me to ask that question?
What's the question?
All right, that's it. I got no solid no's. Well, this is the question, and I've been kind of holding it for a little while, but I also am reluctant to bring it up because I don't know where it's going to go. But Nick, you brought us there, which is around the encounter with spirits and around the encounter of, what the DMT community more often calls like entities, right? But the encounter with spirits, and there's a rich history of spirits in a variety of indigenous cultures. But in particular, for your experiences with acacia and the Australian land, I mean, like, this question isn't clear because it's not clear to me, but maybe it's more clear to you, which is like, what's going on there? What's happening? How does it differ from other plants, maybe, or other places that you've had? It's a really wide open question about spirits, essentially.
Can I give you a simple answer, James?
Yeah.
Everything is spirit.
End of the call.
Okay, I'll just stop recording now.
It's pretty obvious.
Up there, we're done.
Yeah.
Okay, so I meant seemingly sentient, disincarnate intelligences.
Okay.
Maybe it's slightly different than everything is spirit, but that's what my curiosity is.
Yep. Can you repeat the question?
No. I couldn't even answer the first time.
Okay, well, we are talking about a culture that would, I guess, academically be called animistic or pantheistic, panpsychist, in that, every blade of grass, every bee, every bird song is alive and imbued with spirit. But what you're talking about, obviously, is the unseen realms,
The occult forces.
of which I understand through my sort of limited knowledge of indigenous cosmology, there are multiple layers. There are layers upon layers, behind layers, behind layers. And I think it's going to take a while before we can really dial that in and tune that in to understand what exactly we're accessing and at what depth we're accessing it. It still feels a bit random at the moment and a bit unpredictable. I think maybe as the Acacia culture evolves and we, by our just human nature, start to build more of a container around it, that's perhaps more universal rather than individualistic, we might, or if we have the good fortune to engage with Indigenous people and their knowledge of the Acacia, we might start to get a little bit more of a map of where we're going.
I think the culture. Sorry, Liam. Do you want to go?
No, you're right. Go. You go.
I think the culture in Australia is quite interesting because, I've spent a fair bit of time in Europe, and it seems to me that there's less of a discussion in Australia, like are the entities real, or are the beings real, or are there spirits, or is there the DMTLs, autonomous, blah blah blah. And I did a docu-series and tried to find someone to give the perspective, oh no, the beings aren't real, they don't exist. And I really only could find one person who I already knew. I couldn't find someone who had a really good rap about it who I didn't know. So, what I'd found in that, which is part of a broader informal survey, is most people, when they say smoke the DMT or they have the drink the Acacia brew, they very often have this experience of an undeniable and profound transcendental beingness, or being or beings. And the reality of it and the profundity of it is kind of undeniable. And I think possibly because it is so rooted in the land here, that people are less willing to just throw it off as like a drug hallucination or whatever. So it's a little bit like when I went to Brazil a few years ago. I didn't meet anyone in Brazil who didn't believe in spirits, because everyone in Brazil believes in spirits. When I mentioned that some people in Australia didn't believe in spirits, people were surprised, because in Brazilian culture, I think you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone at all who doesn't believe in spirits. So I'd say Australia compared to like Europe or North America, it's very, there's a lot more people here, probably have a lot more experience with DMT as well, which will often take you to these transcendental spaces where you have these experience of the spirit beings. And it's kind of like, it's so sophisticated and profound that it's very difficult to just say it's a, hallucination of the brain. There certainly are people who say that, but there's not so many. It's not so, it's not a big part of the culture.
Yeah, I feel like it's actually the sort of scientific materialist Western cultures that are the only ones that don't have any belief in spiritual entities, and pretty much every other culture has some kind of practice of engaging or propitiating the positive spirits and then warding off the negative spirits. I think actually that was your bit, Julian. Yeah, so you wonder if that's actually just a culturally subjective viewpoint as well, the non-belief in spirits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very much comes from European culture, and the sort of, it comes from the very heady, theoretical Western European culture particularly. And Australia is, although a part of that culture, it's not completely as attached to it as the Western Europeans are in Western Europe. I find them very heady, very theoretical when it comes to these matters, where in Australia it's very much more practical, pragmatic, and experiential. Whereas, you go to Europe and you meet lots of people at these psychedelic conferences who never even taken anything, and you're like, what? You don't really. In Australia, it's much more, direct to people's experience of these things.
I think one of the things that perhaps also challenges that disbelief is the repetition, the archetypes, the commonalities, and particular. I don't think I'd even call them archetypes, because they're beyond that. Like the amount of people that have seen the blue woman, the amount of people that have seen the octopus creatures, the amount of people that have seen the this and the that, and the maps of hyperspace that they attempted on the Nexus. But yeah, there are these commonly seen entities that people are experiencing through DMT around the world in completely separate cultures. They're experiencing the same visions of the same entities.
I read this.
Oh, sorry. Go.
No, you go, Ron.
I was just going to say, I think location plays a bit in this as well. Like my personal view on, why some people seem to have certain experiences versus others. I think, at least in my circle of friends and parts of the community that I know that are more on the side of skeptical and think these are just completely subjective kind of interactions, they're kind of inner city dwellers, and I think that actually has a lot to do with it, like whatever the reasons are, whether it's just the hustle and bustle and the busyness, or so many bods living in small spaces, or fucking EMF frequencies. But, when you kind of get out to more rural areas and you start chatting to locals, it's pretty commonplace that people have a lot of paranormal experiences and stories to tell. I mean, even in Western Australia, the most thick-skinned of, alcoholic miners would have some fucking crazy, mind-blowing bush story from when they went camping that would just send chills, down your spine. And we're not talking about, one person's experience. These are like co-witnessed events, with multiple people experiencing these paranormal anomalies, and Western Australia is just really active. So, I mean, I'd challenge any skeptic that hasn't yet had the experience to go spend a week or two camping in outback Western Australia, and you might change your mind, without any drugs. So, look, and then I guess it's just a matter of relevance. Like, if it's not something within your field of experience, I mean, seeing is believing for most people. So I guess it's just not that relevant. But what I'd probably encourage people that are skeptical to at least maybe support is the off chance that these things are happening to people, because the landscape that can unfold during some people's, psychedelic experiences can get really interesting, and sometimes some, really powerful things seem to manifest, and whether they're there or not doesn't really matter, because if that's what they're experiencing, then they need to find a way to navigate it. So I think more information that's available to help people understand that whole kind of potential and that ecology, the better, because people are having really strange experiences with all of these chemicals. And the hard part, tying it back to maybe the indigenous, dreaming spirits and entities, a lot of it's, once again, secretive and, men's business or woman's business or no one's business. And there's a lot of fear of particular entities or spirits or beings within that culture that they don't speak of, or they're not allowed to. And this is a big problem and issue that I had in a lot of my crazy experiences in Western Australia, seeking out some counsel from Indigenous people that I thought would understand. and they understood, but they didn't want to talk about it. So in terms of having support for these experiences or my own understanding, it was very difficult, because it was kind of sacrilege for me to even be approaching some of, that knowledge, because it terrifies people. Like when it's in the more negative spectrum of these events, it's nothing but horrific. And I think you can't just chalk that up to a bad trip or your own neurology. I think it'd be very dangerous to do that. And I think it is kind of be helpful if the broader community that is at this point very research and scientifically based could maybe allow a little bit more space for people, coming from an angle of, more broad reality of, let's call it the quantum spaces. Yeah.
Basically, if you spend a lot of time in the woods by yourself, eventually you'll see some weird shit.
That's profound wisdom, Nick. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. I was just trying to, boil it down.
You're just your garden variety yowie.
I've heard of yowie.
Yeah, don't lie.
That's a completely different podcast, though.
Yeah.
Maybe speaking of completely different podcasts, this will be a moment to end this stage of the conversation and bring ourselves to a close in the final stage, which is that we'll go in a circle and we'll share one, a singular thought concluding this conversation. So one clear, coherent, concluding thought. And we'll go with in the opposite direction we started based on what I see on my screen. So we'll go with Jef, Liam, Nick, Rohan, Julian, and then we'll end with me. So Jef, you can go ahead. And if you're not ready to share your thought, then you can just pass, and then we'll come back to you at the end.
Yeah, it's all right. Well, I guess it's sort of, it brings me back to when I was writing my thesis, and I sort of started looking into the philosophy of deep ecology with these sort of core principles of, all human, non-human life having intrinsic value. And that's definitely something that shines through with the acacia for me, that we have no right to interfere in that ecology of beings, be they material or metaphysical. That they have the right to their own autonomy and their own sovereignty, and that they are tied to the land. You destroy a place and you destroy the spirits that dwell there. And so God knows how much of that metaphysical realm we've just clear-felled and dug up for uranium, and there's a pretty strong tradition of Europeans decimating indigenous knowledge in this country. So to sort of try and get back an understanding of how the acacia works in the context of indigenous dreams, going to be almost like putting time in reverse, sadly. But then I think through our own individual engagement with it, we're intuitively being taught it again. And whether we like it or not, we become proxy carriers for that. Whether we've asked permission or not, we all ask permission in our own way, I believe, when we're engaging with these plants, because of, I guess, the people that we are and our experience with it. But going forward, yeah, I think we could do with sort of mapping out the territory a little bit for newcomers on not just the metaphysical level, but the conservation level, the respect for the land level, and let the acacia do the rest.
I think I'd just say grow acacias. The rarer, the better, because they need you to grow them more. If you're not eating acacia, then grow whatever you're eating. encourage others to do the same. And stealing a bit both from Nick and Rohan, I think, maybe one catchphrase from each. One is become a plant slave, and the other is, don't think about what the plant's going to do for you. Think about what you're going to do for the plant. And I guarantee you it will be so much more rewarding. You'll get way, way more out of it.
Yep. I totally agree with Liam. Grow the plants. Just thinking back to the question where the Australian psychoactive acacias fit into and how does it inform a deep connection to this land? I just want to talk about my first acacia experience quickly, where I had a certain acacia, and as an immigrant, I'd never really felt Australian. I was always trying to find somewhere else to live, trying to get to America, trying to get to England. But the plant told me very clearly, no, you are from this land because you've spent the most time here, and you are of this land. And that was the first time I ever actually connected as an Australian, was through this plant. And it also told me to get over myself and that I was just a human being, and that just get over yourself. And then I nearly shit myself, but luckily I didn't, and that was a bit disappointing. And it also just told me existence is just a joke that you have to take seriously, otherwise it isn't funny. And I don't think I could have ever thought of that. So that's what a tree told me. So fucking go figure. And I just thought, my God, infinity is a bunch of dead leaves I found on the roadside. How the fuck does that happen? So grow these plants, please.
Oh, that's awesome. Tough act to follow. Just thinking if there's any plant messages that might seem relevant that have trickled through my fingers at times. Look, I think right now the whole planet is, going through an incredibly challenging time, state the obvious. A lot of people are getting really, really in their heads, it's obviously it's the safe place to be, but, I see the way forward, and what psychedelics and these acacias have really kind of helped me to get into is being more in my heart space. And, in my early practice, before I really knew how to do that and what that looked like for me, I asked one of the beautiful East Coast acacias, how that could be done. How do I be more heart-centered and focused? And then this word flashed up in the screen of my mind's eye, just saying, enjoy, and flittering between the E-N and the J-O-Y. And, the N prefixed is endogenous. So it was like, you got to create the joy from within. So do creative things, whether it's singing, playing music, sport, whatever, but something that you're generating from your being. And that's a real help, during times like this. And it's a service. So, these plants, I think, bring many of us into forms of service, whether it's to ourself, first and foremost, our families, our friends, our communities, or the plants, like a few of us in here. So yeah, I think, in these kind of crazy times, service is a really good medicine. And the acacias can definitely help people understand what their service might be. So yeah, I encourage people like the others, grow your own plants, drink your own plants, put your big person pants on, and just start working with it. Be brave. You don't need someone else signing off on every part of your journey. You can do this with the assistance of these substances. And I think the more trust and faith you kind of throw into your experience, it really does pay big dividends, and transformation is absolutely achievable and possible. And yeah, that's about it, really. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think that the global human species at this point in our development, I think that what's happening in Australia is quite interesting, because we have these reference points for these different species and have these open channels with these species. And I think that the arrival of DMT onto the scene, it did pop up in the 1960s a little bit, in the 70s, but it's only really in the 90s, and especially coming from Australia and Brazil, that it started to really sort of penetrate human consciousness. And I think what DMT shows us, like if we can receive the message, is that it's like a lens, it's like a tool as vital to the development of science as the telescope is. And I think it's a tool that we can use to understand and see how immense and complex and sophisticated and infinite reality is. And we can really get a perspective and an understanding that I think rigid belief systems like religion and science have stolen from people. And when you access these plants on your own terms, you don't need a middleman. You don't need a shaman. You don't need the priest. You can find out for yourself how reality is. And you can form allies with these plants and develop your own muscles so you can, get more connected to all of plants and understand that all plants are sentient. Even before I started working with acacias, I was making flower essences in the late 90s. So for me, I, grown that muscle, and I can talk to any plant now. And the interesting thing is, I'm not special. Anyone can do that. But it's up to us to really have an open mind and understand that, all life is sentient. All life, and because it's sentient and intelligent, and it's all part of the same consciousness, it's inherently sacred. And I think that's important that we get that perspective. So in that perspective, there's an innate respect to everything, and all our actions are much more intelligent and conscious and coordinated. And so, when things get a bit hairy, we make smarter decisions. And it seems to me like, we're in a place now where we need the writing's on the wall, humanity. You need to really get smart if you want to survive, that's for sure.
I definitely have the sense that, this isn't stepping out on a ledge here or anything, but that so different plants, different fungi teach different things to different people, but each sort of has its own character, and our usage of them relative to the place and cultures in which we use them will stimulate different ways of thinking about stuff, different experiences, call to different wonderings and different discussions. And I felt excited and curious around what kind of discussion would come out around Australian people drinking an Australian psychoactive plant, acacia specifically, especially given my incredibly limited but very special encounters with it. And I feel validated and pleased with the fact that, yes, a great conversation did come out that felt very unique. And I feel really grateful to have gotten the opportunity to share in your knowledge here today. And I guess with that, I'll also thank you all for coming and participating in the Psychedelic Cafe.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
Right. Thanks, Mr. Jesso.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. That was great. Thank you.
Okay, and cut. That's it.
Yeah.
Hey.
I love, this happens every time with every conversation, that it's like, as soon as it's like, okay, and cut. It's like we're all just posturing the whole time. If you're interested in the conservation pamphlet that Liam Engel produced, I have a link to it on the show notes for this episode at jameswjesso.com. So head over and check it out. It's a really beautiful pamphlet and obviously very educational. I also will have links to the various works of each person that you got to listen to today. So head over there to check that out if you'd like to check them out a little bit more. If you liked this show enough that you feel like others should listen to it, or you found value in it, then please share it about. Taking my Canadian language here with this Australian hat on. Share it about to your friends and fellow psychedelic colleagues. And if you would like to support the show financially, you can do so by heading to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to become a patron, or you can check out the links in the description of this episode for a PayPal donation or a crypto donation. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.